So good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us today on our first substantive meeting as the All-Party Parliamentary Group on the National Food Strategy, where we'll be discussing the question, does a new National Food Strategy require new structures in government? My name is Jo GIDEON and I'm the Member of Parliament for Stoke-on-Trent Central, and I also chair the APPG on the National Food Strategy.
We're going to have a quick introduction to the National Food Strategy by Tamsin Cooper, just so we all understand the objectives, the components and the timeline. We're then going to have a keynote presentation by Andrew Jarvis.
So I've been asked to give a very quick introduction to the National Food Strategy process and where we're at. It was commissioned as an independent review of the food system by the then Secretary of State of DEFRA, Michael Gove, in late 2018. And the idea was to take a whole system view of the way food is both produced and consumed. So we looked from field to fork. We spent a lot of time doing this sort of a diagnosis of the system. We looked into what it was delivering, what were the impacts, both intended and unintended. And following this diagnosis, we've now set ourselves the task of developing a strategy that pivots, that suggests how we pivot the food system from one that is focused or has been engineered primarily around increasing food production to one that delivers multiple societal benefits from the perspective of health, from the perspective of the environment, affordable food, good jobs, and delivers also many of the sort of social, cultural and community aspects of our pleasure and enjoyment of food.
Basic thesis that I want to walk you through is the proposition that the choices we make around the governance really do determine what kind of food future we get. Our food system is highly complex. It's constantly evolving under the influence of all sorts of economic, social, technological, environmental factors, many of them outside the control of national government. And given the shape and the complexity of that food system, it's not surprising that there's a very, very long list of public policies that have an influence on it. And it's quite difficult for any entity within the system to kind of get a grip on that and have the system view and the perspective, keep track of change and understand the interactions. We've got a starting point of our food system as it stands today, and we have an emerging vision for our food system that we want for tomorrow. And we know a certain amount of things, and we know that we don't know quite a lot. So we know that it's going to take us a pretty long time to get there, maybe an effort of 10 years, possibly 20 in some areas. We know that the system is going to be changing all the time. And the proposition, which is perhaps the traditional model that you can have a strategy, no matter how smart the team that's developing it, sit here in day one, publish a strategy that takes us to that end goal, is just heroic. I'm not sure that it's credible. There's too much that is going to be threatening to blow us off course. So that takes you into a realm of thinking about the problem as one much more of what you might call adaptive management, where you've got structures which are agile, which are responsive and inquiring. We can mandate a committee is created or a unit, but they come and go. And then you've got human factors that, over time, memories fade, people move on, civil servants, ministers change, governments change, and so forth. So what do we do with that? Well, I think we can start to piece together some elements of a potential solution. The first one, really key, is locking in that goal, that destination. And for me, that's probably a matter of legislation. That's the only thing that's likely to give you the consistency of purpose that you need here. We're going to need a reporting mechanism that provides regular insights into how far we're progressing, whether we're heading in the right direction. We're certainly going to need a means of measuring and understanding where we're at and where we're likely to be heading. If you've got a really credible long-term governance mechanism, what it can do is actually accelerate your progress towards that endpoint because it de-risks investments that actors in the system are going to make. Independent oversight as well, I think, is a key part of the overall picture. What's interesting where we're at now is actually within this country, there are some models that we might look to for inspiration in this area. And the one that I think comes most readily to mind is 2008 Climate Change Act and the Climate Change Committee. So in that model, we put in place, there was cross-party consensus, we adopted legislation that set long-term goals. And we got this CCC in there as an independent statutory body established to provide advice to government, to report back to Parliament on progress, to conduct research and to engage with stakeholders. And it has a really useful, important role in that particular system that I think is widely considered as a success. And if we look at the CCC, it's not too much of a stretch to put up a straw man as an example. The example here of what a CCC for the food system attached to the strategy might look like with a very similar set of functions.
To any members of the APPG who'd like to come in for a quick comment, a minute or so.
I like what you suggest. I think it's much more likely we will end up more on a rural proofing idea, where you have got a minister, John Gardner, coordinating all the departments on rural proofing. I tried to get that moved into the Cabinet Office and failed dismally.
My ears have pricked up. Obviously, I'm coming to the perspective of the 10 million people that can't put a meal on the table, and that's the food insecurity, which hopefully runs right through this strategy and how we deal with that. Andrew's touched on the potential for legislation. So is that a door opening for the right to food to be put into legislation? Because when we were on the EFRA committee, Henry seemed a bit reluctant to go down that road.
Yes, I'm fully supportive of Henry's national food strategy, fully behind the three calls, the three major calls, obviously, that are in the national food strategy. Like Ian, I'd also like to see a right to food in legislation.
I just want to say that in my experience on this issue, the big thing that we grapple with is this whole debate about whether you have a voluntary approach where it's all about educating people and giving them the right information, or whether you actually have a strongly interventionist approach. And I've always argued for a much more interventionist approach. So I would be very keen to see something that has targets, has deadlines, has very clear strategy, as opposed to just trying to take the public with you.
Let's come to the panel and take these issues a bit further. We've got three people who are going to speak. Kelly Parsons is a research fellow in food systems, policy and governance at the University of Hertfordshire. But I think before that was at the mothership in City University in London. Jane Corbett is a councillor and assistant mayor of Liverpool, and is the lead on fairness and tackling poverty. And Claire Pritchard is CEO of Greenwich Cooperative Development Agency, but also chair of the London Food Boards.
Most of the national food strategies that have been developed to date have been accompanied by some kind of new governance mechanism. So I think it's fair to say we do need some kind of new governance structures in place. But the evidence base on them is pretty patchy. So we don't have any fantastic examples that we can take off the shelf and say this is a great way to do it that's been done in X country. But I think there are good bits that can be cherry picked from what's been done, and there's no point in completely reinventing the wheel, but I think there's also a really important opportunity to create a great world leading blueprint, because there's so many countries dealing with these issues at the national level. Just wanted to echo a few of Andrew's points about what new governance arrangements should be delivering in terms of improving on the current approach. In terms of mapping, measuring and monitoring what's going on in the food system, the system itself, what we're growing, what we're buying, what we're eating and so on, but also the policies and keeping a track of those. They're not kept track of at the moment in any consistent way, and tracking the progress of departments, which I think is an important function. Somewhere where there can be a bird's eye view of the system and the policies and up-to-date evidence, and that can identify connections with them, between them, gaps, redundancies. Someone who's a caretaker of a vision for the food system, ensuring that it informs short-term action. So that means any existing policies or newly developed policies actually have to be measured up against whether they can cohere with that vision.
I think it's a really good start there. But the key thing that's missing for me is that the businesses involved and the organisations involved have to be purpose-driven, not profit-driven. Now, you can say, well, everybody needs profit. Yeah, okay, income over expenditure, fine, but it's how you use it. But let's be purpose-driven.
The London Food Board was established about 2004, and I'm very privileged that I've sat on the Food Board since 2004, and the London Food Board has been a stable, solid structure that has gone through 3 different mayors with 3 different chairs, but we have maintained that look and that momentum with very similar objectives moving forward. Our local authorities deliver food for us. They do trading standards, environmental health, they do the adult learning, they do the new business, they do planning, they do supplementary planning guidance. So if you really want a food system delivered effectively, you need your local authority to be part of that governing structure, and a clear structure between your local authorities, your regional authorities, and the government. And you need it to be agile so that when your local authority says, this is our experience with people with no recourse for public funds or older people that have become isolated because of cuts, they're informing a national strategy, and it needs to be going up and down with that kind of level of intelligence all the time.
But I think the most important thing is, as Andrew was saying right at the beginning, is having a strategy. We must know where we want to get to, and even if we don't quite know at this stage how we want to get there. But I mean, there are so many aspects to this debate, as sort of Andrew's chart of all the various departments that could be involved spoke so eloquently.
We're talking about having an overarching governance system for, quote unquote, the food strategy. We've now come to the point where we all agree it should be principled and responsible and rights driven and purpose driven, but people are saying it should be very decentralized, very local, with a lot of engagement by many different stakeholders. And I'm just curious what your experience tells us about managing a very complex system like that.
That's why it probably needs a combination of different mechanisms, because no one mechanism can fulfill all of these different functions. We can't expect an Office for the Food System to be able to deal with all of the complexity, which is why I think trying to learn a bit from this local level approach, what I call a food in all policies approach of kind of inserting what food can do for you and what you can do for food into the different departments and players who are involved, should be part of that picture as well.
I mean, there's so many things that are done nationally that the impact isn't looked at properly in terms of local impact. So actually, if you look at that with food, if you're looking at, okay, well, what if we did X? What's the impact on the ground? And that's so it's not sort of local or national, it's local and national talking to each other and on the level, and also local having made sure that they're in touch with and listening to people most affected, and that includes the growers and the supermarkets.
I think the question now for all of you as I go around the panel again, Claire, Jane, Kelly, Andrew, and then back to Joe, is committee and climate change model or something else, and why?
I think yes. And why? Because I think we need that independence. I think we need that research base. I love the idea that we have this kind of intelligence that can be referred to, and companies and people that are planning in the long term know that things aren't going to be changing and they're going to have to. So I say yes to that independent structure with cross-departmental understanding and reporting and responsibility.
Yes, and you've got to, if you have a committee, then the committee can hold people to account. But you've got to have a group of people that are cross-departmental that actually do the work, that are the ones that are pulled to the table so that they can be held accountable. And for that, I would have some form of cross-departmental unit.
I really like Andrew's proposal. A few questions it raises for me is, it probably would need to be accompanied by other measures. So does it have clout, and how do you manage that trade-off between it being independent and being in a position to actually force through change inside government? I guess one point I would make about that is a lot of the levers for changing the food system may be held by departments that are traditionally not considered the main food departments, like DEFRA, PHE, DHSC and FSA. So how you kind of take account of that as part of any kind of internal unit, I think would be important. I think supporting it with legislation is a good idea, but I think there are issues around what you can make substantive commitments within legislation, which has been the experience in Scotland, as far as I'm aware.
My proposition around this straw man was not that we outsource policy making to an external body. And that isn't what the CCC does. It's about scrutiny. You do need the internal coordinating structure. But if I was running that unit, my job would be a hell of a lot easier if there's an organisation outside government that is looking in and providing that challenge, saying, what are you doing? Are you on track? Because it gives me the convening power. That external force that would induce people, make it worth their while to really collaborate. All the other points I thought were brilliant. They illustrate the fact that you need places to have dialogue and engage with people, and that it's an ongoing program with a core purpose where issues will need to be surfaced, engaged with, dealt with, allocated.
I think there's a very strong mood in the meeting that some kind of joined up thinking at the centre is going to be necessary if the strategy is going to be delivered.
I think it's been an absolutely excellent meeting. I just want to thank all the panelists, all the people who commented on the chat. You know, we have to look at so many different issues, but my takeaway phrase was from Kelly, where she said, what we could produce here is a world-leading blueprint. I think that is our aspiration, and that would be fantastic if we could.